Okay, so we'll get started now. Hi everyone, my name is Nicola. If you did the tournament on the weekend, I was one of the CAs there. I hope that you don't take my motion setting there as indicative of my overall judge experience, but what we're going to do today is just go over how to judge BP in particular. Hopefully some of you have some experience judging 3v3, which is, I think, a lot less of a complex process given that there are only the two teams, but we'll still go over the judging fundamentals as well anyway. So, first thing I'm going to do is a quick defense of why you should adjudicate, because I think there's a rather unfair perception of adjudication as just kind of what you do if you can't debate. So if you trial for a contingent as a debater and you don't make it, you go as an adjudicator, or if you're not really sure how good of a debater you are, you judge instead. I think that's super unfair and also incorrect, because adjudicating on its own is a fun and enriching skill, right? Like you're being presented with a series of arguments and you get the kind of fun little puzzle of working out which defeats what. And that's, I think, and it's also enriching in its own right. It helps you think clearly about arguments you're presented with in everyday life. If you ever do something like a thesis where you have to do a bunch of readings, you get to be really skeptical of a lot of claims that are made in the papers that you read. And I think that's just a generally important skill. It makes debating work. So you literally can't run tournaments unless you have adjudicators. I would note that, as Eleanor mentioned, ABPDC is coming up, and currently we are not compliant with a number of judges that we need to send, which indicates, and as a result, they would have to cut teams because you literally cannot have debating tournaments without adjudicators. So I don't know why this is prejudice about it, because it's actually the cornerstone of the activity. Additionally, if you do care about improving as a debater, one way to do that is to adjudicate, because you get to see some often really good speeches and learn from them, but you also get to see speeches or debates where maybe there's one thing where you're like, man, this whole debate would have been so much clearer if there was better setup, for instance. And then you can just implement that feedback into your everyday life. You can not everyday life, but into your everyday debates. You can do better setup and make it easier for the adjudicators that you have. And lastly, I think adjudicating can be a good place to start, not from the perspective that it is easier necessarily, but I think that the gradations which are available in adjudicating are much gentler than those in debating. So you can be a trainee or a panelist, as we're about to discuss on the next slide, so that if you are genuinely lost, you've never been in a debate before, that you can be a trainee where you get to experience the debate and have some degree of input without a great deal of pressure on you, as opposed to debating where it's everyone at every given level of experience does a speech. You can ease into it and do it at your level of comfort much more when you're an adjudicator. So let's talk about the kind of what adjudicating looks like, starting with the types of adjudicators. This will probably be familiar to you if you've done 3v3, but I'm going to go through them anyway. You've got the chair of the debate, who's typically the most experienced adjudicator on the panel, or for whatever reason, the AdCorp has trusted them with the capacity to have the most responsibility in the debate. So they're the ones who typically give the oral adjudication. They, in the instance that there is a split where all calls have an even number of people voting for them, have the casting vote, so that they have, I guess, a special degree of voting power. Additionally, they have the responsibility of running the debate. So that looks like doing a pronoun round and taking names for the ballot, so being the one who talks at the beginning of the debate, inviting speakers up, and there's something, I don't know if this is still a thing, I might need some of the pros to correct me here. The 1 minute rule, is that still a thing at Worlds? So a fun thing that exists in BP, but not in 3v3, is that once you are called up as a speaker, if they say, for instance, now I invite Prime Minister to begin their speech or whatever, you have a minute before your speech time starts, so you can't stand up and faff about for over a minute, and that's something the chair gets to keep track of, which is fun. Timing the debate, so all speakers, as I'll get into later, should be timing the debate, but doing the kind of claps when the protected time ends and resumes, and towards the end of the speech is something chairs should do. Maintaining order, so if for whatever reason there are people who are disrupting the debate, for instance, asking POIs in protected time, if they're speaking too loudly at the bench, the chair gets to be order, and tell them to stop it during the debate, or during their speech, and then afterwards kind of remind the room of proper decorum. And additionally, if no one's offering POIs, the chair gets to be I remind people to offer POIs during their speeches. So an awful lot of responsibilities, but they are crucial in making the debate function. You additionally have panelists. So panelists get input into the end decision, and they essentially have the equivalent of a vote in ballot judging. So consensus judging, which is what BP uses is where instead of everyone submitting a ballot and then working the result out from there in the way that you do in Australs, which would be very difficult with BP for reasons we'll get into in a second, you kind of have a discussion and decide upon the order of the debate as a result of that discussion. If you can't decide on an order, then it goes to a vote within the prep room, within the deliberation, and a panelist gets input into that vote, and if they form a majority, they can roll the chair. So they can be the ones who have the majority decision and supersede the chair's decision. In contrast, you can be a trainee who can't roll, like they effectively don't have that voting power, but they still can and should be involved in discussions. So you observe the debate, you still should be coming up with a call, and then afterwards you use that as an opportunity to talk over your call with the chair and with any panelists, and to work out if you were to be a panelist or a chair, how would you approach explaining that decision? These three types of adjudicators typically track with the level of experience that you have. So in terms then of what deliberation looks like and the kinds of results that you get look like, BP uses consensus voting. Typically, actually I might need to fact check this as well, typically there are 20 minutes of deliberation, right, allotted in kind of a general schedule. I know for 3v3 it's 15. I think for most BP tournaments it's 20 minutes, but you should have a vote and a decision done and the ballot in by 15 minutes, and then spend the rest of that time writing the OA for whoever is going to be delivering it. The types of calls you can get are, firstly, you can have a unanimous call, which is where from the beginning, everyone's 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the same. That is pretty rare anywhere outside of probably the first round of a tournament, which is where the matchups are the most random. Even then, it's pretty rare to get an absolute unanimous call, but you can get that. Much more common version is consensus, which is where after some discussion, everyone agrees without having to go to a vote at the end on what the order of the debate should be. And I would note here that because you're ranking all 4 teams, it's often the case, maybe you've got 2 teams in common, maybe you agree on who comes first and who comes fourth, but the teams who come second and third are where you're where there isn't an agreement. So that discussion time, that 15 minutes, is then spent working out, okay, who should actually come second and who should actually come third. Can be more complex than that, but oftentimes it's a pretty simple discussion. When you are doing that discussion, you shouldn't be afraid of switching around your calls, because unlike something like Australs style 3v3, you're not committed to your call from the second that you make it. You are able to say, oh, actually, you know what, I changed my mind, I agree with you. I think CG should come second instead of third. It's all right to switch your call. In fact, it's quite good to be able to admit once you're presented with a different way of viewing the debate, perhaps there was information or content that you weren't weighing particularly highly, perhaps you overcredited certain material. It's okay to admit that, because judging is not an objective activity. Oftentimes, you are a human, not a computer. You can have your mind changed. But by the same token, you should not be afraid to stick to your guns. If even after discussion, you genuinely still maintain the read that you started with, you should stick with that and not just be pressured into changing the perspective that you have for the sake of making it easier for the chair. If they are a good judge, and I guess just generally a good person, they're not going to be offended by you disagreeing with their call there. If they are, that's something that you can maybe take up with equity or something, because it's just kind of unacceptable to be you can't have a call but mine when you are on a panel for the purpose of diversifying the calls that exist. So feel free to discuss it with people. It's not a bad thing to flip your call. It's also not a bad thing to stick to your guns. The job of the chair is to facilitate a civil and productive discussion of these kinds of splits. And I would note that if you just do identify that, for instance, everyone has the same first and the same fourth, the chair's job is to help you negotiate who gets second and third, if that is where the difference exists. That is the most productive use of time as a chair. Obviously, I think I have seen deliberations where it kind of goes everyone announces their call and the chair goes, cool, this is my call, here's why it's correct, and spends the rest of the time writing the OA. That is not particularly helpful or productive or even that civil. So ideally you reach a consensus after some discussion, targeting the most important parts of your the differences between your calls. But if you can't reach an agreement, then that is a split call. If the chair is in the majority, just like in 3v3, the majority call is the one that is put on the ballot and the chair gives the OA. If the chair is in the minority, the majority call is still the one reflected on the ballot, and a panelist can be asked to give an OA, which is called rolling, when the panelists are the ones whose call is reflected on the ballot. And I would note that for BP, you can have splits in just particular calls. So in the prior instance, if you all agree on who comes first and fourth, and there's a split on, let's say the two panelists think that CG should come second and the chair thinks they should come third, the call will be that CG comes second. The chair can give part of the OA explaining why, maybe some general feedback and who comes first and who comes fourth, and then they can hand over to a panelist to explain why the call went the way that it did. If they want, I think in BP it's not compulsory, whereas in 3v3, if you do roll the chair, a panelist has to give the OA. In the event that a panel has an even number of people, or that each potential call has an even number of people voting for it, the chair gets a casting call and they give the OA. So, any questions, I guess, on any of this stuff? Should be fairly straightforward, but cool. All right, you're welcome to ask questions throughout. So, what to do during a debate? This should also be pretty similar with your experience with 3v3, if you have any. First is you should be timing speeches, noting that, obviously only one person is required, and sometimes not even any person, because that's a job you can automate with time kept, where you should be clapping at the relevant intervals. But you should all be timing speeches, even if you don't have to do so to do the clapping, because it's just useful for you to know when arguments are made in certain speeches, especially because if an argument is brought up in the last 30 seconds of a speech, that's something that not only gives you an indication of how much effort they put into making that argument, but additionally, you can give feedback to a person to say hey, that argument was super good, it should have gotten more than 30 seconds of your time, so it is useful to time even if you don't have to in order to maintain order in the debate. You should also be taking notes, which may sound like a really obvious thing, but having adjudicated many competitions with a vast range of people, a lot of people just straight up don't take notes throughout a lot of the debate, which is insane. So I'm going to give you some reasons why it's a good idea to. One, or things you should be taking notes of, things that the debaters are saying, so the specific content of their speeches, even if you think it's not important, even if you think it's been said before, you should be writing down what is being said. Secondly, commentary on things they're saying. So perhaps you think an argument is being made unclearly, or there's a premise missing, or the example they use is quite good. You should additionally be taking notes on that, not only to inform the feedback that you give to that person, but when you look back over your notes, sometimes if you just write down the headings of what people say, it's easy to over or undercredit it based on your assumption of how well that argument was made. But if you say they made X argument and they didn't prove it especially clearly, that means it's easier for you to value that contribution in comparison to, say, the closing making a better iteration of that argument. You don't want to dismiss it as derivative if it was not made particularly well at first, at opening. Additionally, you should be taking notes on POIs, and I think this is especially important to take notes on the content of POIs, on who asked them and what the response was, because it's easy to neglect POIs because they're kind of an interruption in a speech. However, POIs are an important form of engagement during a debate, and it's especially important you take notes, obviously be consistent, but in the closing half of the debate, opening teams don't get any more speeches. The only way that they can engage with closing teams is to ask POIs of them, and so if you're not taking good notes of POIs, then you're just completely neglecting the engagement, that the only chance that they have to engage in the second half of the debate, which is pretty unfair. Additionally, you should be noting down tentative scores. So I'll discuss it more a bit later how you should be scoring. But after each speech, what I like to do is give a range of a score, which I think would be appropriate. Maybe something like 77 to 79, put that beside the speaker's name. And the reason for that, I think it's important to do it throughout the debate as opposed to after the debate, is it's very easy to have a recency bias where you think, wow, that op whip, they sure did sum everything up super well. That was a pretty good speech. That PM, gosh, they barely said anything because maybe the debate went in a totally different direction. And maybe you undercredit that Prime Minister if you haven't already noted next to their name that they did a particularly good job for the role that they had. So please don't just sit there and look disinterested. In general, across the whole debate, but especially in particular speeches, I just want to emphasize that because not only is it super disheartening to be sitting there explaining and people are just staring blankly back at you, but if you're the only person in the debate that is happening to, that is super, super discouraging. Even if all you're taking notes of is what you would do better as a speaker, that's fine as long as you're taking something down so you don't upset people who you are watching. I'm going to now go over how to make a decision between two teams, but does anyone have any questions at this point about I guess the role of judges, of what they do in the debate, etc.? Hopefully Hopefully that's all clear. Cool. So, I'm going to start with how to make a decision between two teams. And I would note, obviously, there are more than two teams in a BP debate, but the way you should be making decisions between four teams starts with this kind of fundamental unit. First question to ask is, who are you as a judge? You are the ordinary intelligent person, or the average reasonable voter, or some other three-word combination of those, like, I guess, adjectives and nouns. And what that means is that you are reasonably well informed, but you don't have any niche knowledge. I think the official World's Manual definition is like, you have read the front page of every major world newspaper that day, or something like that, which I think is much more informed than the ordinary intelligent person is. But what it means is something like, you probably know who Kamala Harris is, but you may not know the intricacies of the US justice system, right? You don't have the spec knowledge of the degree that you may have, so you may have to neglect certain information that you do know, but you don't punish a team if they don't give structural reasons as to who Kamala is, for instance. You're able to make small logical inferences, but you're not able to fill in logical gaps. So if a team is standing up and they're explaining like, this, government's policy results in thousands of people dying because of lack of access to healthcare, you can infer that that is a bad thing without them having to explicitly state it. So you don't have to pretend that you have no conception of kind of like consequences and impacts. But by the same token, you can't fill in logical gaps. So if that same team making that claim says the government bench results in thousands of people not getting access to healthcare, and they don't specify the consequence of that lack of access to healthcare, you can maybe infer that it's a bad thing, but you can't take that leap and say, well, that probably leads to people dying, and kind of do that work for them. So you can make small logical inferences, but you can't fill in massive gaps. Additionally, you have no biases or particular political leaning or specific lived experience that would colour your opinion of a certain debate. So if the teams in the debate want to claim that a certain party gets into power and that's a good thing, they do have to give reasons why that is the case. They can't just be like, oh, this makes a progressive party more likely to get in, and not explain why that may be a desirable outcome, because you as the OIV, or the OIP, I guess in this case, unnoticed person, are more likely to, are not persuaded by that. What this means is that you should evaluate teams on their arguments as they are presented. Don't do any work for them, but also don't do any work for them. Don't punish them for not doing, like, you can be a normal human being and infer that people dying is bad, for instance, but also don't let them use debate as shorthand to do work on their behalf. I think in debating, it's quite common to have people go like, and this is bad for minorities, and not explain at all why we should care about minorities, when I think it is quite easy to prove that that's the case, but it's important that you're not letting them rely on like debaterisms, I guess, in an unfair way. Make sure that you are making those teams do the work. So what you need to determine as a judge is, of these two teams that we're considering in this context, who had the more important contribution to the debate? And the way that you do that is to ask, what is left standing in each case? So taking the two cases that you're comparing in this instance, ask, what was proven by each team? How well was it proven? Was it proven to sufficiency? And I would note the reason I include that is like, it's obviously often quite difficult to prove things beyond a reasonable doubt. Perhaps we're proving things more on like the balance of probabilities if you want to use those standards of proof. But you don't, was it just proven to be quite likely the case? Were there any missing premises or steps that would cause you as the ordinary intelligent voter to doubt the premise or doubt the argument right off the bat without any response? Were their claims believable? Were they well reasoned? Did they give justifications for why they think the actors they outline will act the way that they do? And I would note that all of these questions, it's very difficult, like I can't tell you like, here is what constitutes a well-proven argument, because it's incredibly specific to the debate, to the speakers, etc. But make sure you're asking these questions, and your standard of like, is this proven enough, is just something that you have to kind of cultivate over time. And something that obviously debaters in the debates can make claims about. Additionally, what of the claims that teams made was disproven by the opposition team? And in this case, when I say the opposition team, I mean the one that you're comparing them to. So was there any direct responses from one team to the other that damaged the team that you're considering? Was there anything that was flipped? So was there anything that was proven, but the outcome of which was claimed by the opposition team? Was there anything that was mitigated? So the full extent of perhaps a harm or a benefit was significantly shrunk by the engagement from this other team. So you're asking all of these questions, and you kind of come down to, what you boil this down to is, for each team in this pairwise comparison, what did they actually contribute to the debate that was not reduced or taken away by the engagement between these two teams? The next thing you want to ask is, of what is left, what is more important? What of them, both cases, is more definite, so what is more likely? Which impact is larger in scale, or perhaps deeper? Which impact impacts more vulnerable people? These are all very basic metrics of importance that if you were have done debating previously, or probably were taught to use to make your impacts more evident. I would note that obviously you can use the kind of metrics that you already know, but I would note that you should use the weighing that teams give you in the debate first and foremost. And what I mean by that is, if the debate is, you could, for instance, apply a metric of scale to the debate and say, well, which team had the biggest contribution? But if all teams in the debate are preoccupied with which team is best for minorities or something like that, or which team is best for the most vulnerable stakeholder, that is a metric you should prioritize in your adjudication, because that is what they told you was important, and you should abide by that. So I've got an example here. This is a presentation from last year that I have updated. This was an example from an internals debate. I don't know if anyone who was in that debate is in the room, but I promise I'm not harping on about it because it was an especially egregious debate. I remember people at the time were like, hey, that was my argument, but I don't know if they're here. So the example I've got is, in this House would pay politicians the national median wage. OO made the claims that this is silly because this increases corruption and politicians become less representative of the general public. Yeah, so was I. Oh, yeah, I know. I forgot who made the arguments. But let's say OO says that this increases corruption and politicians become less representative of the general population because now they're more susceptible to being bribed by corporations or whatever. CO says that this causes governments in developing nations to shit themselves, essentially, because the median wage is $2 per day. So governing already unstable countries becomes impossible because no one in positions of power is being paid enough money to make a living, essentially, and be paid a living wage. The harms CO identify are larger in scale than the harms that OO identify, because OO, I think, implicitly place sets the debate in the developed world. So the consequences to the developing world are much greater because their government becomes totally untenable as opposed to just slightly more inefficient. The harms are more definite because the impact of being paid $2 a day versus whatever the median wage in the US is per day, it's more likely that the former example is one where that would cause widespread chaos. And I think they also affect more vulnerable people just by virtue of the fact that people in the developing world are often already have things like worse social safety nets, etc. So you could then claim that CO's contribution to this particular debate is more important than OO's contribution. So that is just an example of how you compare the contributions of two teams, especially two teams that did not explicitly rebut each other. Does anyone have any questions then about comparing two teams in a debate? Cool. So the next thing to do is compare four teams in a debate in making a decision. It's important to note that you aren't just putting the teams in a random list of 4 from most to least favorite. You're making 6 pairwise decisions. Each team must beat the teams below them and be defeated by the teams above them. So what that means is that you should be able to take any team in the room, let's say OO, and say, how does OO relate to OG? Do they beat or be beaten by OG? How about CG? How about CO? Those pairwise comparisons, you work each of them out by doing what I just described, that process of comparing the two teams. As a result of this, you should have a call after opening half of the debate because OG and OO have already completed their contributions to the debate, so that should not be influenced by the closing half all that much. The only case I can imagine it being influenced is if they use POIs particularly well, but I think that's quite unlikely to change the opening half because usually POI engagement affects the way that opening teams are situated with the closing team that they are POIing. So it's very rare that your calculus on what opening half should look like should change after the DLO has sat down. Then at the conclusion of each of the closing teams, slot them into the overall ranking based on who they beat and who they are beaten by. You must be able to justify each pairwise call. So if an adjudicator asks, hey, okay, why does this team specifically beat that team? You must be able to give an explanation. You must have thought about that. Not only because that's just how BP works, it isn't just kind of like an arbitrary ranking of like favorites, but because deliberations often involve you having to specifically defend placing one team above another. And this just makes it much easier for the deliberation to operate when you have specifically compared those teams. So for instance, you could have a series, if we're on a panel of 3, you could have a series of calls that look like this, and this isn't that uncommon, especially in later rounds of tournaments where teams are pretty close or in particularly messy debates, where every team has a different team coming, assuming this is first, second, third, fourth, every team has a different first, every team has a different second, every team has a different third, and I guess in this case, 2 of the teams agree on fourth, but not all of them do. What you should do then, if you're presented with this, as a chair, but also as a panelist, the first thing you want to work out is like, do you agree on anything? All 3 of these teams have CG over OG, so that's not really something that you need to like spend a lot of time on. Then looking at the up bench, 2 of the judges have OO over CO, but this judge has CO over OO. So maybe you spend some time asking this judge to identify, hey, can you just justify why you put CO over OO, and then work out that split. Maybe they agree, actually, I agree that OO's contribution was greater. And they flip that call, and that's another thing everyone agrees upon. Then what you need to do is work out where GovBench sits relative to each of the closing teams. Maybe you want to talk about OO specifically. Maybe you want to work out if they do come first, if they are beaten, or if they are beaten by CG but not by OG, if they are beaten by both government benches, and if they come third or whatever. And you kind of go through it that way. There is no other way to work out what this should result in, because this is really messy and annoying. The way you have to get around it is by working out those specific pairwise comparisons, because there is no other way to litigate it. Does anyone have any questions about how to make a decision between 4 teams? I have an example in the next slide, but any immediate questions? Cool. Do you want me to bring your laptop to you?
To the bathroom.
Oh, okay, cool. So I've got an example of a topic of this house would ban zoos. It's pretty straightforward. This is not a particularly comprehensive example of a debate, but hopefully it makes it clearer. I'm assuming as well, everything I put on the screen is going to be like the totality of which team proved what in the debate. This is going to be a pretty underwhelming debate. So OG proves that zoos are bad for animals because they are stressful and not particularly stimulating. And that's all OG proved. OO proved that zoos are actually better for animals than the wild, because the wild is like much more stressful and less stimulating for animals or whatever. And also that zoos are fun to attend. CG makes a claim that zoos are stressful for animals, and they spend a lot of time explaining this claim, but that is essentially what they contribute. And CO contributes, 1, that zoos provide a specific mechanism for conservation, so therefore they are good for the species overall. That zoos generate public interest in conservation, which is something that no other team has mentioned. And also they give more detail as to why zoos aren't stressful for animals, not just less stressful than the wild, but they aren't stressful in general. How would we come to this decision? The first thing you want to ask is what happens in opening half. OO probably beats OG because they prove that zoos are better for animals than the comparative, which is the wild, and I guess they have the extraneous benefit that zoos are fun. So at this point, OO is beating OG. How does CG factor in? OG probably beats CG because CG, by the looks of this at least, were derivative. It's kind of obviously the way the debate plays out. Being derivative is something which can be quite hard to judge. But based on this alone, if all CG proved is that zoos are stressful for animals, seems like OG already proved it, and like the value of that sentiment was already communicated in the debate. Then OO also probably beats CG because they preempt the material about stress by explaining that zoos are less stressful than the wild, so it is already defeated by the material which comes out of OO. So at this point, OO is beating OG as it was before. Now CG is being beaten by both of them. Lastly, bringing CO in. CO probably beats OG because they prove that zoos are good for individual animals, but also animals collectively, which is a greater scale benefit. CO probably beats CG for the same reason. Again, if CG was derivative, that means a lot of the analysis probably applies to CG as well. And CO probably beats OO because they explain a wider scale impact. So it's not just about individual animals being better off, it's about populations in general, and because the benefits that they identify of being good for conservation probably deeper or more important generally than just like people having fun. So you would arrive at this call. Does anyone have questions at this interval? Does this make sense? Most of the debates that you see will be far more complex than this, but that is the process that you should go through of thinking, how does each team factor into where? Hopefully that is plausible. In terms of some miscellaneous other concerns then, the first, this debate is moving super fast. What should I do? And I would note that given that the speeches are only 7 minutes and you've got POIs, I think it is kind of more difficult to track BP debates than 3v3. The most important thing to do is keep your notes in order. So make sure you're taking down things, even if you don't fully get what the speaker is going for, just make sure you're taking notes of exactly what they're saying, because it's important that you don't miss things, given that part of your job as a judge is to work out where claims were made in the debate, because if a closing team legitimately makes a vertical extension or says something that was already said by the opening half, it's important that you know when things were said and where, to what level of detail. What you can do is you can take, if you're a chair, you can wait to call before you call up the next speaker, or you as a panelist or a trainee can just say, hey, sorry, can I have a minute? After a speech, just to kind of summarize what you had, like what you were kind of thinking or working through. In the same way that speakers get a minute grace period after they're called, I feel like it's fair for judges to take a minute, literally a minute, so make sure you're timing yourself and not going over, to just get your head around what was said. Obviously it's varying levels of relevance depending on where you're adjudicating, but especially for international tournaments, if you're listening to people speak with accents that you're not super familiar with, taking that extra time is probably a lot better than totally undercrediting or undermining the claims that they made, because perhaps you're just not super used to hearing the way that they speak, and not being super across what they're saying. Next concern, a closing team explained more clearly why they win than their opening did. Does that mean that closing wins? Opening teams can obviously preemptively try to weigh their contributions, but they don't know what closing will say, whereas obviously closing knows what every team has said. Do not punish opening for not being prophetic, weigh them in good faith, right? All the closing teams will say, here's how we beat each of the other 3 teams specifically, and sure, that can be quite compelling, but obviously opening teams don't get that same opportunity, so don't use the fact that they didn't specify how they beat every single other team to justify putting them lower than closing teams. 3, a closing team is saying stuff that sounds a lot like their opening. What do I do? Do not reward arguments which are derivative. You have to judge closing teams based on their novel contributions, so based on things that they specifically brought to the debate, not just stuff that they rehashed which was already brought up by their opening. However, derivative is not the same as building on a premise that opening mentioned. Vertical extensions are legitimate. So you have to ask, are they meaningfully extending upon what their opening said? Does that extension add anything to the debate, or are they just kind of retreading ground that was already covered? So, for instance, in the debate about banning zoos, if you're just kind of reproving that animals are particularly stressed out, that probably doesn't do all that much, especially if, I guess, in the example I gave, CG doesn't deal with the counterfactual of being in the wild. If they're just giving more reasons why animals at zoos are stressed, that probably doesn't meaningfully add anything to the debate. But if, for instance, it's a policy debate and CG explain why this policy is likely to be done well, which is something that OG maybe relies upon but doesn't explain, that could be a very valid vertical extension, because that probably unlocks a lot of the benefits that OG rely upon. So that particular extension is something that is valid. Another concern, CG has the most important claim in the debate, and they build on things that OG says. Does that mean that OG should win instead? Or does it mean OG should come second? The first thing I'll say is that there are no relationships of entailment in BP judging. So one pairwise split ought to have no bearing on any other. What that means is that the fact that there is a relationship between what CG and OG say does not mean that CG and OG should auto kind of be clumped together in the debate. You should be evaluating the contributions of CG against the op bench and against OG, and the same with OG. You should be evaluating it against each specific team. That being said, be consistent and fair in your judging metric. Were OG's claims more important than CG's? Is the groundwork that OG sets up more important than other teams' contributions, right? Again, specifically asking like, what did this team actually contribute? How does it weigh up against the contributions of other teams? And there is no like auto second or auto first because you think that OG does something that CG benefit from. Therefore, if CG beats all other teams, then transitively, OG must also beat up all other teams. You need to do that work separately. People keep asking POIs, should I care? I've already kind of answered this, but like, yeah, POIs are a fun and necessary part of the BP format. Answering POIs indicates a team's ability to engage with other teams. Failure to take a POI technically can't be punished, but does reflect a lack of engagement, which may be damaging. So if you as a team do not take any POIs, you probably don't engage as well with the direct questioning of other teams, and that can be reflected in things like tie breaks and your speaker scores. POIs can be a chance to push diagonal engagement. You can bring opening material into the closing half. You can give opening a chance to respond to closing POIs. They are just an important part of the format, and you should be taking notes on them as well as considering their consequences highly. Asking a good POI can be very strategic and helpful. Speaker scores. So the scale for speaker scores, unlike 3v3, is from 50 to 100. But I would say it's super, super rare to get anything outside of the scale from 65 to 85. Most often, speeches fall between 68 and 82, I would say. 75 is still the average, but the increments are further apart. So an Australs 74 may be like a BP 72 or 73. An Australs 78 may be like a BP 79 or 80. I think there is an actual mathematical conversion. I haven't worked it out, but generally, given that there are more scores that you can reach, given that you're not capped at like 80, for instance, the increments between each kind of level are greater. What time is it? Sorry, Oscar. All right, cool. I'll bring your laptop to you. Yeah, cool. So Google the world's judge manual and scroll to the bottom of it to access the world's speaker scale. Alternatively, I think you can just Google world speaker scale and it will come up. I think it's from, the one that comes up is from Korea, but like I don't know if it's been updated all that much. Still probably pretty indicative, at least for like minis and stuff. You should be able to use it to inform. And then it'll say like a speaker range and then what a speaker who fits in that range should demonstrate. You can use the range. So margins between first and fourth can end up looking pretty dramatic. When you input margins on TabbyCat, it has like the margin between the first and the fourth overall. And it can look pretty daunting if you've given a debate by like a margin of 9. But that's totally fine in that means that on average there's a gap of 3 points between each team, which is like close but clear, right? So it can look like a lot, but it's okay to use the range. Don't be overly punitive for the sake of having a big margin. I feel like some people are very big on using the range and as a result of that probably like to inflate it because they go wild with the power of being able to go over 80. But it's okay if you do actually end up having a big margin, if it's justified. As you go, as I flagged earlier, make sure you're writing down tentative speaker scores so as not to undervalue opening. And then speaker scores are also decided by consensus. So you can have a discussion once the order of the debate has been decided, because there are no low point wins. So you have to have the order of the debate decided overall. Then that's when you go through and you say like, all right, who do you think on this team, what do you think the range of this debate was speaker score wise? What do you think the range of this team was speaker score wise? On this team, who do you think contributed more to the debate? How great was the difference between speakers? And from there, you kind of work out who gets what speaker score. Then, how to give a BP OA. Start with general feedback. Try to have some, even if you think people in the room are more experienced than you. It is just a good activity to try and think of feedback when you watch debates. Even if you were like, whoa, this is super, super good and I just don't have anything to say. You probably do. Like, debaters are seldom perfect. Not only is it important because you are able to, I guess, improve by thinking critically about the debate, but also it can help contextualize your decision. So if the whole debate suffered from a lack of like weighing or something, that's something you can foreground in your general feedback, and then that's probably reflected throughout the OA as well. Give the call next. Don't be suspenseful. Suspense adging is pretty grim in 3v3, but in BP it is even worse because it's almost impossible to track what's going on unless you're like writing down kind of every mention of a team. Just say the call outright. note splits or disagreement where they arose. So I think it's important, and this is true of any OA that you do where there's a panel, if there was disagreement about where teams should go, even if it doesn't result in an actual split, I think it just is helpful to flag to teams like, hey, the reason that there was some disagreement on who should come second versus third, for instance, was that some of the panelists did not buy this particular claim, but I did, for instance. And as a result of that, maybe in future, like as a piece of feedback, you could spend more time proving this principled claim or whatever, but noting them throughout the decision. There are kind of two ways you can give a BPOA, because it's not like there is just no scope to do a kind of issue by issue. Actually, I don't know if there is. Don't know if I've seen someone give an issue by issue BPOA, but the ways I think are most common to do it, you can either go chronologically through the debate, which is what I prefer, where you explain the contribution of OG, then OO, then you explain in the opening half who beats whom, then you say this is what CG did, then you explain what they defeat or are defeated by, and then you add in a CO and you do the same thing. So by the end of it, you're going, this was CO's extension, here's how it interacts with OG, here's how it interacts with OO, here's how it interacts with CG, and that gives context to the whole decision. The pros of that approach, I think you just are less repetitive because you're going through each team one by one. You're giving equal attention to each team, and you also give the opportunity for each pairwise split to be covered, so that if people are like, okay, I can see why we didn't win, but how did we lose to that team? Like, you do go over that in the OA. The cons, I think, maybe I'm just biased. I think this is probably a good way of doing it. Maybe sometimes you are predisposed to give less time to closing teams because it's easier to litigate the opening split than it is to just like you spend more time litigating an opening split, which is much more resemblant of 3v3, and then the closing half is just like, here's their extension, here's why it was good or bad. But you can just like adjust for that to make sure you give enough time to closing. Or you can go in the order of the decision. So you can go why the first team came first, why the second came second, or you can go in reverse. I think the pros of this are like, I don't know, some people like it. It may be more approachable, like if that's more intuitive to you to explain, here's why each team gets the position that they do in the order that they do. You can give it a go. I think the problem is that it's much more repetitive because you're explaining like why, the way it's usually done is like when you get to the team that came third, for instance, you're explaining why third is beaten by both of the teams above it and beats the one below it. I think just like, especially if you come fourth, it can kind of suck because you just spend like a whole minute just being like, here's why they lose to every single argument in the debate, as opposed to kind of more holistically evaluating the position in the debate. And I would also aim for the length of your OA to be about 15 minutes. I wouldn't go for more than that. I wouldn't go for too much lower than that, although I reckon you could do a decision in like 10 minutes and still be pretty thorough, depending on the debate. So, actually, does anyone have any questions about anything so far? Yeah?
How would you organise your note-taking? Like, if you've got like 14, would you just how do you...
Yeah, so I guess what I do, I don't know if this is the most effective way, but I do a table with 4 cells in it, 1 team per cell, and then within that cell, indent, like, you've got the heading of a point, you've got a sub-reason, kind of indent it so it's clear. Do things like I italicize POIs, I bold feedback, so it's just easier to look at. And then in terms of when you write an OA, what I would do is I would make sure you write down the order that you have, the order that your panelists, if you have panelists, have. And then go through, I would go write the contributions of each team, and then under that, just the other teams that you've already covered. So you've got like OG's contributions, OO's contributions, and then a note of how it relates to OG, and that sort of thing. That's how I do it. I think if you write on paper, probably do something kind of similar, but yeah, I don't know. I think whatever works for you is what you should do, because it can get super, super messy. So the most important thing is just keeping on top of everything. Any other questions about adjing overall? Cool. Oh, yeah?
Someone who's never done any adjing before, how do you recommend getting into it? Like, do you have to do some sort of like what's the best way to get started or get some experience?
Great question. Where could you adjudicate? The first place, and this is, I guess, I'll explain how you can get involved in each. You should adjudicate at internals. Very conveniently for you, we're about to have a debate at internals, which you can adjudicate. And I would recommend doing that, again, as I flagged at the beginning of the presentation, you can be a trainee, which is where you literally just, you sit there, you try and judge the debate as best you can, but there is no pressure on your shoulders to argue for your position. There's no chance that you would be giving it away or anything. So if you are totally new to it, that's a great way of easing into it. It's super low stakes at internals because it's like nothing's recorded. No one cares all that much about the results. You're often on like totally random teams. You're often with your friends, or you could be with pros who can help you out as well. There's literally no consequence. I would encourage anyone who, and the other thing as well about internals is that given that there's no kind of competitive incentive to have, in terms of who gets to adjudicate at what level, if you want to practice giving OAs, I would strongly suggest you ask our wonderful internals officers to be able to adjudicate and specifically to give an OA, because there are pretty much no other contexts you can practice giving an OA that aren't like kind of a bit more stressful than internals, because like you can't like, I guess you could watch a debate and give an OA if you wanted to, but that's hard to get feedback on. So given that most judge tests involve some kind of resemblance of like an OA in terms of justifying your decision, and most minis and majors, if you do want to give an OA, it does have like a consequence on the teams who are listening to it. Ask if you can practice OAs now at internals, and then you can also get feedback from the teams that you give that OA to. I'm sure they'd be happy to. If you want, another place you can adjudicate is Wiggums. If you're not a cis man, it's a super inclusive and fun tournament. I'm pretty sure, someone can correct me, that trials for judges for Wiggums are next week. So I would strongly encourage you to at least trial to be a judge if you're interested at all. Also, if you're trialing as a debater and you don't make the contingent, you can go as a judge. It is like a super fun time, and it is a very NOV-friendly tournament as well. Judge ABPDC, we desperately need people to do that. It's at Wollongong. It's over the 7th to 9th of September. It is a major, which is cool, but you don't need to trial for it. You will need to do a judge test just so that they can work out like what rooms they should put you on. But it is something I would recommend you doing if you're new to judging. If you're not new to judging, basically if you attend the USU, I would recommend that you do it if you're not already debating. Worlds also is another opportunity that you have to judge. I think it's a pretty fun competition to judge. It's in Panama this year, which is sick. I know last year that we had a bunch of judges, but especially first year judges. So I would encourage at least trialing for it because I think it's pretty cool. The other thing you can do is minis. I didn't get the dates for these, but I'm pretty sure it's the weekend after ABPDC is MAC Pro-Am, and then the weekend after that is UNSW Pro-Am. Other opportunities for you to judge BP. Sorry?
Weekend after Pro-Am is weekend.
Okay, yeah, and then after that is Wiggums. So if you want to judge, so minis you don't have to trial in, you don't even have to do a judge test, you just kind of have to do your best on the days. So if you're, again, intimidated by trialing or any sort of doing a judge test or doing it at any sort of major level, judge minis. That's again always appreciated because again you can't debate without adjudicators. That's the end of my presentation. Any more questions? Any more thoughts? Cool. I'm glad. Last year there were a bunch of like very complex, like if OG beats CG, and then CG beats CO, and then CO beats OO, but OO beats OG. How do you work that one out? And I just do all the kind of maths standing at the front. But I'm glad that you guys seem to be more across it than the people last year. So if there are no questions, then I'll hand over to Jack.